The courtroom was silent. The only sound was the slow, deliberate tapping of the judge's gavel against the wooden bench. Everyone's eyes were locked on the defendant, a woman in her late 30s, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "Ms. Carter," the judge's voice echoed through the tense room, "the evidence against you is overwhelming. Do you have anything else to say before I give my ruling?" Before she could answer, a small voice cut through the courtroom. "Stop. You don't understand." Gasps filled the air. Heads turned. And there, standing at the back of the room, was a 10-year-old boy, his face flushed, his fists clenched at his sides. The judge's gavel froze midair. The lawyers exchanged stunned glances. The security officers at the door tensed. No one had expected a child to interrupt a trial, and no one was prepared for what he was about to reveal. The boy's name was Ethan Carter, and today was supposed to be the worst day of his life. His mother, Sarah Carter, was on trial for a crime she swore she didn't commit, a crime that could take her away from him forever. She had been accused of stealing from the very company she had worked for over a decade, a large law firm that had once called her one of their most trusted accountants. They claimed she had embezzled over $500,000, leaving behind a trail of evidence so damning that even her own lawyer struggled to defend her. Ethan sat in the back of the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely understand all the legal jargon being thrown around, but he understood one thing clearly: they were about to take his mother away. And no one was stopping it. Not her lawyer. Not the jury. Not even the truth. Because the truth was being ignored. But Ethan knew something no one else did. And he wasn't going to let them ruin his mother's life without hearing it. Sarah's defense lawyer, Daniel Brooks, was struggling. His arguments were weak, his confidence shaky. He was up against a ruthless prosecutor. A man named Richard Calloway, who had built his entire career on locking people away. "The evidence is undeniable," Calloway said smoothly, pacing in front of the jury. "Bank statements, withdrawals, digital footprints, all leading directly to the defendant." Sarah's lip quivered, but she remained silent. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze downward. Calloway turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution rests its case. We ask for the maximum sentence allowed by law." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He could feel it happening. The judge's face was stern, his fingers already gripping the gavel. The decision was coming. And that's when Ethan stood up. His small voice rang out through the courtroom, shattering the silence. "Stop! You don't understand." The entire room froze. The judge blinked in disbelief. Who is this?" Sarah gasped. "Ethan? Her son wasn't supposed to be here. She had told him to stay home. She had told him that court wasn't a place for children. But Ethan had snuck in anyway." "I need to say something," Ethan insisted, stepping forward. "Please, before it's too late." The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "Son, this is a courtroom, not a school debate. Sit down before I have you removed." But Ethan didn't back down. He turned to look at his mother, his only family, the woman who had worked day and night to keep him safe, to make sure he had food on the table, to give him the best life she could. And now she was moments away from being taken from him. He swallowed hard and looked back at the judge. "I know who really stole the money," Ethan said, his voice shaking but clear. The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, whispers. The judge's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" Ethan clenched his fists. "I know who really did it. And I can prove it." The courtroom was no longer in control. Because a 10-year-old boy had just changed everything. The courtroom was in chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as Ethan Carter, just 10 years old, stood trembling but determined in the middle of the room. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, his voice booming over the commotion. "Order," I said, "order in the court." Slowly, the whispers died down, but the tension remained thick. The judge turned his sharp gaze to Ethan. "Young man, step forward." Sarah Carter's face went pale. She shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "Ethan, no. Sit down." But Ethan ignored her. He had held on to the truth for too long, and now, with only minutes before his mother's fate was sealed, he had no choice but to speak. He took careful steps toward the witness stand, his small hands trembling at his sides. "State your full name for the court," the judge ordered. Ethan swallowed hard. Ethan James Carter. You understand that lying under oath is a serious offense? Yes, Your Honor, Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. The judge studied him for a long moment. You just claim to know who really stole the money. Is that correct? Ethan nodded. Yes, sir. I do. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutor, Richard Calloway, chuckled under his breath. Your Honor, this is absurd. We're not about to let a child disrupt legal proceedings with baseless accusations. Are we? Ethan turned his head toward Calloway, his eyes narrowing. It's not baseless. Calloway's smirk faded. The judge adjusted his glasses. Mr. Carter, do you have proof to back up this claim? Ethan hesitated for a split second. His mind raced. He had no fancy documents, no evidence that a lawyer would consider solid. But he had seen something everyone else had missed. And he knew exactly who was behind it. I don't have papers or bank statements, Ethan admitted. But I know the truth. And I know where you can find the proof. The judge leaned forward. Go on. Ethan turned and pointed straight at someone sitting in the courtroom. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Everyone turned to see who he was accusing. And the moment they saw, the air grew impossibly still. Because Ethan wasn't pointing at some stranger. He wasn't pointing at a suspect the police had missed. He was pointing directly at his mother's boss. A man named Gregory Langston, the CEO of the very company that had accused Sarah Carter of stealing. Langston, a tall man in his mid-50s, sat stiffly in the courtroom, his expression unreadable. Calloway's confidence wavered. This is ridiculous. The boy is making wild accusations? I'm not lying. Ethan's voice was firm. His eyes locked onto Langston. I saw him. That night when the money disappeared, I was at my mom's office. I was waiting in the car when she ran inside to grab some papers. She didn't know I got out, but I did. And I saw him. A murmur swept through the courtroom once more. Langston's jaw tightened. The judge raised an eyebrow. What exactly did you see, young man? Ethan took a deep breath, recalling that night as clearly as if it had just happened. It was really late past my bedtime. Mom told me to wait in the car, but I got bored. So I went inside to look for her. Ethan paused, his hands shaking. That's when I saw Mr. Langston in her office. And he was using her computer. Langston's face remained eerily still, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think much of it. Until the next day, when the police showed up at our house and said my mom stole the money, Ethan continued. But she didn't. He was in her office. He had access to her files. He could have taken the money and made it look like she did it. Sarah Carter covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. Her lawyer, Daniel Brooks, suddenly sat up straighter, as if seeing the case in a new light. Your Honor, if what this boy is saying is true, we need to investigate Mr. Langston's access to company accounts. Calloway scoffed. We are not going to take the word of a 10-year-old, then check the security footage. Ethan interrupted. There are cameras in the building. Look at the footage from that night. It'll show that he was there, not my mom. The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. Langston finally spoke, his voice calm but cold. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The cameras are controlled by my company. We investigated them long ago, there was no such footage. Ethan's stomach twisted. He hadn't thought of that. If Langston controlled the security cameras, he could have erased the evidence. But Ethan wasn't giving up. He turned to the judge, desperation in his voice. If the company erased it, maybe the security company still has backups. They keep records, right? For the first time, the judge's stern expression wavered. He turned toward Sarah's lawyer. Mr. Brooks, is this a possibility? Brooks cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. Security footage backups are often stored separately from internal records. If there was tampering, the security company might still have the original files. Calloway, looking increasingly frustrated, shook his head. Your Honor, are we really going to chase the accusations of a child? This is a court of law, not a playground. But the judge wasn't listening to him anymore. He turned to Ethan. Son, if I order an investigation and this footage doesn't show what you're claiming, your mother's sentence will proceed immediately. Are you willing to take that risk? Ethan didn't even hesitate. Yes, Your Honor. The judge sat back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench as he thought. Then he turned to Brooks. Motion granted. The court will subpoena the security footage. The courtroom exploded. Ethan felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. For the first time since the trial began, someone was finally listening. But as the noise filled the room, Ethan glanced at Langston, and what he saw sent a chill down his spine. Langston wasn't arguing. He wasn't panicked. He was staring straight at Ethan, and he was smiling. Not a nervous smile, not a friendly one. A cold, knowing smile. And in that moment, Ethan realized something terrifying. Gregory Langston wasn't just a thief. He was dangerous. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The way Gregory Langston was looking at him, it wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse. It was certainty, like a man who knew he wouldn't lose. Ethan shivered but forced himself to stand tall. He had done what he needed to do. The judge had granted the motion. The security company would be forced to hand over the footage. It was over, or at least it should have been. Langston finally looked away, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit as if he had already moved on from the matter. The judge banged his gavel again. Court is adjourned until the footage is reviewed. We will reconvene in 48 hours. Sarah Carter slumped in her seat, her hands covering her face. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. Ethan hurried over to her, wrapping his small arms around her. "You did so good," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. "I'm so proud of you." But Ethan barely heard her, because as he turned his head slightly, he caught sight of two men in dark suits slipping out of the courtroom. They hadn't been there before, not sitting with the prosecution, not among the witnesses. But the moment Langston stood to leave, they followed. Ethan didn't know why, but his stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. The next 48 hours passed in a blur. Ethan barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Langston's smirk, heard Calloway's scoffing voice, and felt the weight of knowing that this fight wasn't over. But when the court reconvened, Ethan walked in with his head held high. His mother's lawyer, Daniel Brooks, had spent the last 2 days working to get the security footage from the company's backup servers. And today they would see the truth. The courtroom was packed. The press had caught wind of the shocking interruption by a 10-year-old boy, and now reporters lined the back wall. Langston sat calmly at his table, a cup of water in his hand, completely unfazed. But Ethan saw it now. He was too calm. "Your Honor," Brooks began, standing confidently. "As per the court's order, we requested the backup security footage from the night in question. The security company confirmed that they store unaltered copies of all recordings for 6 months. The judge nodded. "And do you have the footage?" Brooks hesitated. And then Ethan's heart plummeted. Brooks sighed. "Your Honor, the footage is gone." Gasps erupted throughout the courtroom. Sarah stiffened beside Ethan, her face turning ghostly pale. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Gone." Brooks clenched his jaw. The security company's database was mysteriously wiped clean 2 days ago. Ethan's mouth went dry. 2 days ago, right after the judge ordered the investigation. His eyes shot to Langston, whose expression never changed. Because of course it didn't. Langston had been ahead of them the entire time. Calloway wasted no time jumping in. "Your Honor, I believe this proves the child's claims were nothing more than a desperate distraction." Ethan jumped to his feet. "No, that's not fair. He did this. He knew we were looking. So he got rid of the footage." Calloway turned toward him, his expression almost pitying. "Son, I understand you want to help your mother, but in court, we deal with facts. And the fact is, there is no proof to support your story." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. His chest burned with frustration. He had been so sure this would work. So sure that if he just got someone to listen, his mom would be safe. But he had underestimated Gregory Langston. He had played fair, but Langston hadn't. And now he was going to win. The judge exhaled. "With no evidence to support the defense's claims, this court has no choice but to proceed with sentencing." "No!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to listen to me. He's lying. He's lying. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him close. Ethan, stop. It's over. Her voice was hollow, defeated, and that was what finally broke him. She had fought for so long, but now she had given up, and Langston knew it. As the judge began speaking again, Ethan turned and looked at the CEO one more time, and he saw it, that same cold smirk. He had won. Unless, Ethan's mind raced. Langston may have wiped the footage, but that night, Ethan had been there. He had seen something that might still prove what really happened. And in that moment, Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to fight fair anymore, because Gregory Langston had made one mistake, and Ethan was about to use it against him. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the judge's voice. His mother's sentencing was moments away, and Langston was sitting there, calm as ever, knowing he had won. But he hadn't. Not yet. Ethan's mind raced, piecing together details he hadn't considered before. The security footage from the restaurant was gone. But that wasn't the only camera that had been rolling that night. He spun to face his mother's lawyer, whispering urgently. Mr. Brooks. The parking garage, there were cameras there too. Langston came in through the side entrance that night. I saw him. If the restaurant footage is gone, we can check the garage. Brooks hesitated, hope flickering in his tired eyes. Ethan, are you sure? Langston's smirk faltered. Ethan saw it. The first crack in his armor. I'm sure, Ethan said firmly. The courtroom had fallen silent, all eyes on the 10-year-old boy who refused to back down. Ethan turned to the judge, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Your Honor, if we check the garage security cameras, we'll see him arriving and leaving that night. If he wasn't there, then what's the harm in checking? The judge rubbed his temple, clearly weighing the situation. Calloway immediately jumped in. Your Honor, this is absurd. We can't keep delaying these proceedings on the wild theories of a child. The boy makes a valid point, the judge interrupted, leveling Calloway with a sharp look. Then he turned to the defense table. Mr. Langston, since you claim to have nothing to hide, you wouldn't object to retrieving this footage, would you? For the first time, Langston's expression changed. It was subtle, just a slight narrowing of his eyes, the faintest tension in his jaw. But Ethan saw it, and so did everyone else. A heavy pause filled the room. Then, finally, Langston cleared his throat, his voice smooth but forced. Of course not, Your Honor. I have no issue with transparency. But Ethan knew he was lying, because Langston had made a mistake. And this time there was nothing he could do to erase it. The next morning the courtroom was packed. Reporters had filled the seats, murmuring about the 10-year-old boy who had outsmarted one of the most powerful men in the city. Ethan sat beside his mother, gripping her hand as they waited. This was it. The judge entered and called the court to order. We have reviewed the newly retrieved security footage from the parking garage, he announced. The evidence is damning. Langston sat stiffly at his table, his jaw tight. He knew what was coming. Brooks stood, his voice strong. Your Honor, the footage clearly shows Mr. Langston arriving at the restaurant that night, contradicting his sworn statement. Not only that, but it captures him leaving through the emergency exit moments before the police arrived. He was there and he knew exactly what happened. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge's expression darkened. Mr. Langston, do you have an explanation? Langston hesitated. For the first time, he looked unsure. Calloway leaned in, whispering urgently to him, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. Sarah squeezed Ethan's hand, tears pooling in her eyes. The judge sighed heavily. Given this new evidence, the case against Ms. Carter is dismissed. Ethan's breath caught. She is free to go. The room erupted. Sarah let out a sob, pulling Ethan into the tightest hug of his life. You did it, she whispered. You saved me. But Ethan wasn't looking at her. His eyes were locked on Langston, whose face was drained of color. Because the judge wasn't finished. As for Mr. Langston, we will be opening an investigation into obstruction of justice and perjury. Bailiffs, take him into custody. The click of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom. Langston shot Ethan one last look, cold, furious. But Ethan didn't flinch. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, justice had won.